Good morning, good evening, and a very good afternoon to you wherever you may be in the world. A very warm welcome to this, the 27th Munich Lectures in Economics and the annual Center for Economic Studies Distinguished CES Fellow Award. My name is Marcus John Henry Brown, and I will be guiding you through the next 90 minutes of laudation, lecture, and a Q&A debate where you, the audience, can get involved and ask questions. But more about that a little later on. This event, ladies and gentlemen, is important. The list of names who have been honored with the title of Distinguished CES Fellow really is an A-list of economist excellence. Jean Tirole, Paul Krugman, Peter Diamond, Oliver Hart, Bengt Holmström, difficult name for an Englishman, and Esther Duflo, no less than 6 distinguished CES fellows have gone on to win the Nobel Prize in their respective fields. In fact, legend has it that Bengt Holmström practiced his Nobel speech during the 2016 Munich Lecture. Now, as you can see, we are not streaming from the IFO Institute, and this certainly isn't the LMU in Munich. This evening's event is, in fact, being streamed from Harvard, Stanford, and 3 separate locations spread across Munich because of COVID-19. COVID-19 has an incredible talent for wrecking plans, monthly, daily, hourly. And it's apt that an evening that focuses on the research topic of working from home should involve participants that are all broadcasting from home. So with that in mind, it's time to start the Munich Lectures in Economics 2020 properly with the welcome address from your host and the Gastgeber for this evening, Professor Dr. Clemens Fuest, the president of the IFO Institute and the director of the Center of Economic Studies.
Thank you very much, Marcus. It's a great pleasure indeed to welcome you all, wherever you watch this, to the 2020 Munich Lectures in Economics. Our distinguished CES Fellow and Munich Lecturer this year is Professor Nicholas Bloom from the University of Stanford. We are truly delighted, Nick, that you accepted the prize and of course that you accepted to deliver this lecture. A very warm welcome also to Professor Rafaela Sadun from Harvard University, who will deliver the laudation tonight. I'm also delighted that we are joined by Florian Engelmeier, our dean. So Florian, it's great that you are here. At this point, I normally say welcome to Munich, and then there is a round of applause for the 2 of you in particular. So please, imagine this applause this time. Now, what are the Munich Lectures? The Munich Lectures honor an outstanding economist whose research is not only academically excellent, it should also be policy relevant and help us understand the real world. The Munich Lectures were founded by our colleague and friend Hans-Werner Sinn, who also founded the Center for Economic Studies. Every year, the CES Council selects one of the world's leading scholars to be awarded the CES Distinguished Fellowship and to deliver the Munich Lectures. Nick, you are the 27th Distinguished CES Fellow, and we've already heard from Marcus that the other 26 are an impressive lineup, but you totally fit in here, so no pressure on you. Now, understanding the economy and providing policy advice based on state-of-the-art research is certainly always important, but it is truly indispensable in times of crisis like now. The coronavirus completely changes the economy, and it also changes the way we work, and we're observing this in this moment. Now tonight, Nick Bloom will present research about working from home and why increased working from home will not go away when the pandemic is over. I'm looking forward very much to learning why this is the case, but before we get to the lecture, it is time for Raffaella and her laudation, and that means over to you, Markus.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Clemens. Now, as Clemens just said, it's time for this evening's laudation, and we're honored to be joined by Professor Raffaella Sadun, who is Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. Raffaella's research focuses on economic and cultural determinants of managerial choices, as well as their implications for organizational performance. As you may have guessed, I didn't write that. Raffaella shared the same PhD supervisor with this evening's Distinguished CES Fellow, and she has also written extensively with him. So there really isn't anybody better suited to hold this evening's laudation.
Clemens, Nick, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor and privilege to give this laudation for Distinguished CES Fellow Prize for Nick Bloom. In receiving this prize, Nick joins a wonderful group of scholars. Just looking at the past 3 years, Amy Finkelstein, Thorsten Persson, Susan Athey. Let me just start by saying that the reasons why Nick deserves to join this amazing group are too many to be summarized in a short speech. What makes this task even harder for me personally is that Nick, besides being a superstar economist, is also a mentor and a friend. So with these caveats in mind, I will try my best to convey my observations on Nick's contributions. Looking superficially at his CV, one might think that Nick had been destined to an academic career since a young age. Nick received the best education available in Great Britain, earning his degrees from 2 distinguished institutions with a bachelor degree from Cambridge and a master's degree from Oxford. He then completed his PhD in economics at UCL under the supervision of John Van Riener, a shared supervisor, and Richard Blundell, a past CES fellow recipient. However, it is perhaps not known to all that Nick's path to today's prize is far from that of the typical academic superstar. In fact, it is safe to say that in the early stages of his career, Nick actually tried his best to avoid to become a professional in academia. His PhD in economics came almost haphazardly as a consequence of his stint as a research economist at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, a renowned think tank in London. And even after his PhD, Nick did not even go into the traditional academic job market. He told me too much math and not enough excitement to take a job at McKinsey. Thankfully, John Marinen was able to correct this obvious mistake, hiring Nick back just after a year or so as a research officer at the Center for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics, which meant the honor of inhabiting a windowless office instead of the standard cubicle that was given to PhD students in a dark corner of the CP floor. Nick's brilliance started to shine even outside his small group of collaborators very quickly after his joining the CP. He was snatched by Stanford, hired as an assistant professor, and then very rapidly granted tenure in both the economics department and the business school. And the rest is history, as they say. One way to read these events is that Nick succeeded in academia in spite of these unusual beginnings. The underdog narrative is very attractive, but in fact I believe the opposite is true. In some sense, Nick's unusual path to the top of the economics profession may be exactly why we are here celebrating him today. First, this unusual path exemplifies Nick's willingness to engage with the real world. Surely his research is rigorous and technical, sometimes intensely so, but when I look at his vast and varied academic output, a consistent trait that unifies it, be it in macroeconomics, I/O, labor economics, or management, is its ability to speak to first-order real-world issues. The role of uncertainty on economic activity, the importance of management and organization on productivity, the determinants of innovation, how inequality manifests itself across firms. This is just a sample of the first-order topics that Nick has studied over the past few years. Nick's success makes it look like dealing with such big questions in economics is an obvious choice. But in reality, we all know that this is a choice that involves many risks. How can you say something truly new and distinguish yourself in topics so vast and so well researched by others? And how can you do so credibly? Nick overcame these non-trivial challenges with impressive and consistent success. Beside his intellect, I think his secret weapon is his monstrous curiosity, which leads him to approach big research topics in a very personal and real way. Nick constantly talks and engages with a wide variety of people inside and outside academia around the world, listening, and he truly does listen to what they have to say. The ability to interface with the real world in this way allows Nick to consistently look at old topics with fresh eyes in ways that would not be possible with a more insular and detached approach to economics research. Instead of ignoring real world for the sake of elegance, something that economists sometimes do for better or for worse, Nick is able to let the real world and economics work together in a truly complementary way. Second, Nick's early steps in the profession exemplify his ability to wholeheartedly embrace innovation and change. Nick is an innovator at his core. He innovates within fields, especially from an empirical standpoint. For example, creating new measurement techniques. Just to cite a few instances of this innovation, his work on management. He contributed to the creation of new indices of economic uncertainty that are now widely used in both macro and microeconomic research. He created new measures of expectations in collaboration with several statistical offices around the world. And he created new measures to understand innovation and how innovation happens within firms. Nick also innovates by creating new fields of inquiry altogether. In this instance, Nick is impressive in his ability to be a pioneer in topics that become obviously interesting to others only after he starts working on them. A clear example of that is his research on working from home, another brilliant paper in which he and his co-authors were able to randomly allocate the right to work from home across a large set of workers in a Chinese firm. Several years ago, this research looked a bit extravagant, like a diversion among economists. But the forced working from home experiment that we are all living during this COVID pandemic puts this pioneering research under a very different light. Attacking first-order questions and doing so in such a rigorous and innovative way is more than enough to explain why we are here to celebrate Nick today. I want to conclude, however, by saying that what makes today's achievement even more impressive to me is the fact that Nick was able to do so, maintaining throughout his career, from the dark office of the CP to his sunny office in Palo Alto, a profound sense of humanity and respect for others. Nick is a master at creating productive and long-lasting partnerships, regardless of people's fields of study, gender, seniority. This is clear from his many activities. He bridges macro and micro interests as the director of both NBR Macro and Productivity and Innovation Groups. He has worked successfully with people from industry, government, and academia. He's a mentor to many, me included, and has continuously forged fruitful collaborations with young and old researchers year after year. All this does not happen by chance, but is a direct consequence of Nick's profound respect of other people's ideas, generosity with his time and advice, commitment to other people's success, and ability to empower others. Nick shows the tremendous power that research can have once we focus on ideas and people and ignore the hierarchical and cultural differences that so often mar our profession. I believe that these are all essential aspects of Nick's contribution to academia that deserve to be emphasized today. So, dear Nick, your research has helped build new fields and has breathed new life into first-order economics questions. You are an example of how economists can go after important questions and contribute to the real world in an impactful and rigorous way. You show that it is possible to arrive at the top of the economics profession, crafting your own very personal path. Most importantly, you show that it is possible to be successful in our profession while demonstrating profound humanity and respect for others. I wish we could celebrate in person, and while we wait for that time to come, I wish you all the best for the next steps in your career.
Thank you so much for that, Raffaella. Now, we've now reached the part of the evening which is unfortunately almost impossible to do virtually. Nonetheless, by embracing the spirit of the Munich Lectures and the core ideas of CES, we're going to give it our best shot. So I'll hand back to the director of CES, Professor Feust Clemens, who is now finally joined by Nick Bloom, the Distinguished CES Fellow 2020. Over to you, Clemens.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you very much, Raffaella. I learned a lot about Nick here, but I could also see him. I think the first time I met Nick was back in Oxford when you visited the center at the time, because as you said, Nick has worked on so many things. He's also worked on tax, which is my field, and the impact of uncertainty on investment and things like that, which was very important. Also for my own work. This is the award ceremony, Nick, and it's actually my first online award handing over. So let's try. What's coming now is a long and formal sentence. After all, Munich is a place in Germany. So, okay, but I will read this to you. Now, under the auspices of the Dean of the Economics Faculty, Florian Engelmeier, and after selection by the CES Council, the Center for Economic Studies of Ludwig Maximilians Universität Munich awards Nick Bloom, William Eberle Professor of Economics at Stanford University, the prize as this year's Distinguished CES Fellow, and nominates him to give the Munich Lectures in Economics 2020. Now comes the second sentence. With this award, the Center for Economic Studies honors Nick Bloom's significant contributions to managerial and organizational economics. Now, congratulations, Nick. This award comes with a plate, as a proof. I can only hold it here. I hope it's visible. Oh, here it is. Okay, here it is. So, there is. Okay, I hope you can see it.
We should pass it through the if we have 3D printing, we can.
Yeah, it would of course be easy to do that, but I think I will have the opportunity to hand it over personally. Why is that? Now, every distinguished CES fellow is of course invited to Munich to spend a couple of days here and interact with colleagues here at Munich and our guests. And Nick has accepted to do so in the summer of 2021. So next year, by then, the virus will please have been reined in by one of these formidable vaccines that are moving the stock exchange at the moment. And Nick will organize a workshop here in Munich jointly with our colleague and Dean Florian Engelmeier. The title of this talk will be Empirical Management. Nick and Raffaella will be there, and many other leading economists, including people like Steve Hansen from Imperial, Vanessa Schreiber from Oxford, or Simon Jäger is also someone who will be there, to name just a few. So this workshop will offer opportunity to interact and develop new projects. And so on. Now, in the unlikely case the virus will still be around, we will again do this online. Then we'll have to rethink the plate concept and get 3D printer out. But let's be optimistic. I very much hope we will be able to meet physically here in Munich and hand over the plate, for instance, in the beer garden. Hopefully not damage it. Okay, thank you very much, Nick. Congratulations again. And over to you, Marcus. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, Maximilian, I think we should give Professor Nicholas Bloom a big round of Zoom applause. If we can manage that now, that would be excellent. Yes, excellent. So, congratulations, Nick. I have now got a very long sentence that I need to read, all of your awards and achievements before we actually finally get to your lecture. So Nicholas Bloom is an Englishman who lives with his Scottish wife and American kids on the Stanford campus. He is the William Ebeler Professor of Economics at Stanford University, Senior Fellow SEPA, and the co-director of the Productivity, Innovation, and Entrepreneurial Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He is the Fellow of American Academy Arts and Sciences, the recipient of the Alfred Sloan Fellowship, the Bernacker Prize, the European Investment Bank Prize, the Frisch Medal, the Kaufman Medal, blimey, and the National Science Foundation Career Award. His research focuses on management practices and uncertainty. He previously worked at the UK Treasury, McKinsey & Company, has a BA from Cambridge, an MPhil from PhD from the University of London, and an MPhil from Oxford. This evening, Nick will be sharing his research, his findings, and his ideas with his 2020 Munich lecture, which is called Why Working from Home Will Stick.
So I'm extremely happy to be the distinguished CES lecturer, and I'm going to talk about why working from home will stick. It's joint work with Jose Barrera ITAM and Steve Davis at Chicago. So over the last 20 years, we have seen news coverage of working from home rising by about 5% a year. I realize you probably can't see that, so I should move this down here. Okay, by about 5% a year. So this is a graph of newspaper search across around 2,000 US national, regional and daily local newspapers of the frequency of the word working from home. And you can see it's rising. Newspaper coverage is doubling roughly every 10 years, 12 years, with a couple of spikes. Marissa Mayer canceled working from home in Yahoo 2013. And more recently, a couple of US politicians were both injured in weird incidents in the same week and had to work from home. But that is nothing compared to what happened during the pandemic. So since, March 2020, working from home newspaper coverage has increased by 12,000%. So there's just been an explosion of interest. And if you look at the y-axis, you can see now roughly 1 in every 50 US newspaper articles talks about working from home, which is just incredible. So let's, to set the scene, let's look at before COVID. Before COVID, only 2% of Americans had full-time working from home. So this is data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It surveyed around 10,000 Americans in 2017, 2018. You can see 15% of Americans ever work from home. And of that 15%, only 2% did it 5+ days a week. So before COVID, it was really rare to work from home full-time. During COVID, this has exploded. It surged to almost 40%, so a 20-fold increase. If you look on the left, this is data from monthly surveys of 2,500 Americans aged 20 to 64 that earned $20,000 or more in 2019. So these are people who basically should be working this year. Question is, what are they doing? And if you look on the left, in May, 42% were working from home. 33% were not working, which shows how bad the recession was, and 26% were on business premises. Our most recent month's worth of data from the end of October shows working from home share has fallen, but it's still incredibly high at 32%, remembering it was only 2% before the pandemic of full-time working from home. So while this has been claimed as a success, and I want to argue over the next 20 minutes, this has been a success, it's also been very hard for many people. So on the left and in the middle, photos from a couple of my students of some of their more challenging working conditions I uncovered as I was, talking to them by video calls. And on the right is more of a personal issue. It's my youngest. I have 4 kids. They're all home school, basically, because California, still the schools are mostly locked down. And, while my 5-year-old is very sweet, she's frequently coming in my office. So it's not the easiest setup. There's also little consensus on how working from home has worked, whether it was stick. So here's a photo of Reed Hastings. I guess he's happy because Netflix has definitely done very well, judging for the amount of Netflix we've been watching in our house. He said, I don't see any positives. Not being able to get together in person, particularly internationally, is a pure negative. So Reed Hastings is against working from home. Interestingly, he goes on to say, begrudgingly post-pandemic, they're still gonna have 1 day a week working from home. And I'll come back to that in a bit. On the other hand, Hayward Donegan, who's the CEO of Rite Aid, which is an interesting firm. They're a very large pharmaceutical drugstore retailer in the US on pretty much every high street. She says, we've adapted to work from home unbelievably well. We've learned that we can work remote and that we can hire and manage a company remotely. So I'm going to talk about today the research questions is firstly, how much working from home will there be after the pandemic? Now I'm going to argue quite a lot. Secondly, what economic mechanisms facilitate a persistent shift towards working from home? And finally, what are the implications of more working from home post-COVID for a number of things, and particularly inequality, cities, productivity, and time use? So let's start with our data. It's primarily survey data. So we've surveyed so far, we run 15,000 surveys in US workers. We're doing monthly waves. We had a double wave in August to get a bigger sample, but monthly waves of 2,500 American workers. We randomly sample US residents aged 20 to 64 that earned $20,000 or more in 2019. This is from an internet panel. And then we re-weight them to match the current population survey, so the kind of population survey in the US by earnings, industry, state, sell. And we ask about 40 questions a month, and I'm going to show you some data from this. Before I do, you probably want to know how representative is this survey of the US, which, more broadly, I know I'm, speaking in Germany, but the US looks broadly similar to the UK. I have some data on it, and not that, reasonably similar to much in Northern Europe. So on the top row is the data we re-weight to, so earnings, industry, and census division. You can see black is the raw data, red is re-weighted, and finally in green is the CPS. You notice in black, we're pretty close actually, we're not that far off. We tend to be slightly more higher earners, slightly less lower earners. When we re-weight, we align very closely. At the bottom are three other cells we don't re-weight by: education, age, and gender. And again, you see these things will line up very well. So what do we know? What's the current state of working from home? So as I mentioned earlier, there has been a massive increase in working from home. It is now, in terms of the share of paid days work from home, about 10 times higher. So there's various ways to measure working from home. Probably my favorite is the share of working days, full working days that are fully work from home. So before COVID, if you did the maths on that initial bar chart, it's kind of complicated, but if you added up all those little bits, you'll discover that before COVID, Americans work from home for about 5% of working days. During COVID, from our survey, we know in May that peaked at around 60%, has been falling back, and over the whole COVID period, it's averaged at about 50%. So there's about a 10x increase, which is obviously an enormous increase. This has been concentrated in higher earners, and particularly the more educated. So particularly if you look at education on the right, you can see that those with a graduate degree, so a PhD, MBA, master's, etc., are more than 10 times as likely in the US to work from home as those with less than a high school degree. So people that left school before about 18. And of course, it's kind of obvious why. University and graduate educated individuals are more likely to doing jobs like, to be honest, pretty much everyone listening to this and myself, like jobs with computers, kind of managerial or professional jobs that can be done remotely. In reverse, people with less than a high school degree are much more likely to do jobs that require being in a shop or a factory, a gardener, cleaner, something that's effectively more manual. You need to meet customers, you need to work with equipment, etc. What about the future of working from home? So the average employee turns out to want about 2 days a week working from home. So there's a big spread. So it's worth noting there's just a massive variety in what people want. At the top, we notice, this is of people, by the way, who report being able to work from home or did at some point during COVID. So these are people that can. Of those that can work from home, about 11%, so they never want to work from home. They're often younger, single, living in small apartments, and honestly, it's very lonely. I'll briefly talk about a randomized control trial I did on China on working from home about 10 years ago. And one of the big issues we discovered is that full-time working from home gets incredibly lonely and a lot of people don't like it. On the other hand, you notice only 27% of people want to work from home full-time, which is what most of us are doing right now under COVID, because in the sense of a lot of these people tend to be older, married with kids, but even for them, people like me, to be honest, living in a house, I like to see my colleagues. So most people are somewhere in the middle. The mean is somewhere between 1 to 3 days per week. And I'd say there's an average that's around 2 days per week at home, 3 days per week in the office. So what are firms planning? So the most of this graph you've seen before, it shows pre-COVID from ATUS that there are 5% of working days are working from home. During COVID, there are those middle points we've reported from our surveys up to the end of October. It's fallen down to about 40%. We also ask individuals what their firms tell them they're planning, and they're allowed to say they don't know, in which case we leave it blank. We separately, I'm not going to show you today, have a different survey of around 1,000 American firms, which lines up very closely with this. So this isn't just entirely from individuals, it aligns with what we've been told by firms. So basically the numbers look like post-COVID, something like 20 to 25% of working days are going to be spent at home. So clearly lower than now under COVID, but significantly around 4 to 5 times higher than pre-COVID. So working from home will stick, but I'm going to argue it's going to stick not completely. It's going to stick in the way that all of us that are working from home now full-time are going to go back to work in the office 3 days a week, but remain working from home 2 days a week. So it will kind of stick in the extensive margin, but in the intensive margin, we're going to reduce our intensity from 5 days a week to 2 days a week. And that matches very much statements on post-COVID working from home for most firms. A bit of a quote here from Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, where he says, "I believe that we'll return to the way I don't believe that we return. Sorry, I don't believe we return to the way we were because we found that there are some things that actually work really well virtually." So, I personally, since lockdown, since I work a lot and working from home, have maybe spoken to, 1 to 200 CEOs, execs, people. I've done dozens and dozens of presentations and discussions with firms. I've done multiple exec education at Stanford, talked to these CEO forums, etc. There seems to be, honestly, a very strong consensus now that post-COVID, much as Tim Cook is saying here, if you can work from home, post-COVID, you'll probably be allowed to work from home roughly 2 days a week and come in the office 3 days a week. So there appears to be strong upsides of being in the office around creativity, around loyalty and company culture, and around motivation. But obviously some upsides, as I'll argue in a minute, about working from home of greater concentration and employees and enjoy it. So the most common model I've heard is something like Monday, Tuesday, Thursday working in the office. Everyone comes in. We have, lunches together, presentations, all our meetings, all our events, all our client dues. Then Wednesday, Friday, say we all work from home. From the CEO downwards, everyone works from home. And so that's the sense of it's 3 days in the office. All our joint time is together, but we have 2 days at home. So why will working from home stick? I'm going to go through 5 reasons and then finally end with some implications. So one is, just to reverse it, pre-COVID, working from home had a pretty bad stigma problem. It was often nicknamed shirking from home. I used to work from home a little bit back when I was doing my PhD, and my friends would always wind me up over this. So I put up a screenshot here of a image search I did a few years ago. I gave a TEDx talk on working from home, and to prepare for this, I did an image search and I took a screenshot. Here I just punched in working from home, and you can see, the typical images are, it's only one. They're terrible. They're mostly naked people, cartoons, babies. If related searches are working from home funny, working from home comics, working from home underwear. So before COVID, it was seen as, by many people as a bit of a dead end, not really, the best thing to do. That seems to have completely disappeared under COVID. So under COVID, working from home stigma has substantially improved. We asked respondents how much the stigma has changed amongst people and you notice that roughly a third said it hasn't changed, but 2/3 said it improved among most or all people they knew. Secondly, productivity under COVID has dramatically exceeded expectations. So we asked people, compared to your expectations before COVID in 2019, how was working from home turned out for you? And relative to expectations is hugely positive. So I've heard the same thing over and over again from execs and CEOs and managers. Even in Stanford, I've spoken to 3 different groups around Stanford University. The same story, that productivity is well up versus expectations. So it's been a very positive experience, and people are much more optimistic running forwards. Thirdly, there's been a number of investments which are mostly sunk, enabling working from home. So in our survey, we asked people how many hours they've invested in learning how to work from home. So how does Zoom work? What do those buttons do, the boxes, getting pictures put in your room, making a nice background, and then money in terms of buying equipment. I personally bought a proper webcam and a microphone because the one on my laptop was pretty terrible. So collectively, if you cost the hours at the wage rate and you look at the money people spend, individuals report spending an amount that's equivalent to about 1.25% of GDP, and absolutely an enormous amount of money on the individual side. The same thing seems to be true on firm size. So here is a measure from the US private fixed investment in information processing equipment and software, basically, computers and high-tech equipment. You notice it's seen an enormous growth under COVID, not like anything we've ever seen before, because again, firms are likewise spending huge amounts of money on enabling working from home. And most of this is sunk. So in a sense of that, it's going to make working from home post-COVID much more productive. Fourth, there's a residual fear of proximity to other people. So I think the issue here is we've all seen far too many sneeze videos of people sneezing and thousands of particles flying out everywhere. The awareness of germs and bacteria and how infected dense spaces are. So this is just a response from the survey. I'm not sure where I would be on this, but I just tell you the data from Americans. We asked them, if a COVID vaccine is discovered and made widely available, which of the following would best fit your views on social distancing? And notice here that, only 28% of people said they would return completely to pre-COVID activities. And around 40% said they're pretty worried. They're not going to do much at all. Look at the, the bottom 2 bars. They're not going to, or the bottom 3 bars are going to avoid the subway, avoid crowded elevators. Most people are still very nervous about densely crowded places. When we follow up with subsequent questions, it turns out there's concerns over catching other viruses, over future pandemics, over the efficacy of the COVID vaccine itself. There's a number of issues that mean I don't think we're going to rapidly go back to say, my experience of when I used to commute to work and back in London, of standing in very crowded subway trains, or standing in crushed elevators or lifts. I don't see that being comfortable for, the full population for some time. And finally, is what I call network effects. So the fact that it's much more effective to work from home as an individual, as a firm, of course, if others do, if your suppliers and customers do. And there's a number of ways you can look at this, a number of kind of longer run implications. One thing I just put up here, we happen to have data on with Steve Davis and Julia Zestova, which is we're looking at the amount of patents in the US Patent and Trademark Office that mention working from home, telecommuting, etc. And you notice that after the pandemic broke out, based on the very rapidly issued patents, which roughly look similar to all patents in terms of mix, we see that there's already more than a doubling of patents mentioning working from home. And you can project this thing forwards. Not surprisingly, there is massive amounts of innovation going on in terms of working from home technology. I mean, one very simple example, if you've used Teams, you probably noticed that before the pandemic, it only allowed 4 people in the picture. Pretty rapidly in April, it went to 9, and then in September, it went to 49. So I know, because I've talked to Microsoft a lot, they are investing heavily in that, and as are many other firms, teleconferencing facilities, for example, Zoom. So, to summarize, there are 5 big drivers. Stigma's down. It's turned out to be much better than we expect in terms of productivity. There's a lot of complementary investments. A number of people are going to be hesitant to go back to the office with the kind of density that I think we saw pre-COVID. And finally, there's network effects that kind of mean it's almost like a Nash equilibrium. We're potentially shifting to a different equilibrium for which, firms and individuals are going to feel comfortable in. So finally, what are the implications for society and individuals? So the first is inequality. So working from home is a valuable perk. And here's a question we ask people after COVID in 2022 and later: how do you feel about working from home 2 or 3 days a week? And if you said it's positive, we then ask how much of a pay raise as a percentage of current pay would you value as much as the option to work from home 2 or 3 days a week? And if they report negative, we flip it around. And what you can see here is, on average, people provide really pretty high valuations. So the average for this is about 9%. So they're reporting the ability post-COVID to work from home 2 to 3 days a week is worth about 9% of earnings. I mean, on the one hand, that seems very high. That's probably similar to a healthcare package in the US or, say, generous pension plan. On the other hand, if you can work from home 2 to 3 days a week, you dramatically cut down on commuting. The average American spends an hour each day commuting. So that's you're saving yourself 2 to 3 hours a week, which is a lot. I mean, imagine if you spent that on, say, going to the gym, you'd suddenly become incredibly fit. And you can potentially move further out. You can, move out to the suburbs, get a bigger house, have a different lifestyle. These are, this is really quite a valuable perk as people respond in surveys. Now, if you look at who's getting this, there are 2 lines here. On the x-axis is the annual earnings people told us they made in 2019. And on the y-axis is the share of paid working from home days post-COVID that they want. And what we see is the employee desired in black circles here, that's at about 40%. So it's saying basically employees of all income levels are saying they would like about 40% of their post-COVID work days to be working from home, about 2 out of 5 days a week. If you look at what employers are telling them they're planning, what people say their employers told them that they're planning to happen, you see this is very upward sloping. And this matches, earlier data and pre-COVID data. Basically, higher earners tend to do the types of jobs that are more easily done at distance. They're more managerial, professional. Lower earners tend to do jobs that you really have to be there in person. So this highlights almost immediately this big inequality issue. Those on the right of the graph, those earning, 200,000 or more, basically can get what they want, which is a perk worth, as you saw on the last slide, maybe about 10% of earnings. And those on the left are not very likely to get it. Secondly, the impact on cities. So working from home is not surprisingly highest amongst employees from city offices. So if you look at on the left where people report they previously worked, it was mostly cities. On the right, they're mostly in offices. And at the bottom, I put in, my 4 previous employers before Stanford University. These are all city offices. It's the LSE, McKinsey, the UK Treasury, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Now, that suggests large reductions in city center spending. So on the left is, the previous slide in a slightly more formal way. It shows logged population density on the x-axis and employer planned working from home days on the y-axis. And you can see this is upward sloping, significantly upward sloping. So employers in more dense places, i.e. city centers, are planning significantly more working from home than those in the suburbs or in rural areas. On the right, we also look at weekly expenditure near work. So we have 3 questions on our survey about how much you spend around work, 1 on food and drink, 1 on entertainment, and 1 on shopping, going at lunch to buy, your husband or your wife a present, etc. And you see this is also steeply sloping upwards. People that work in city centers also tend to spend on average $250 a week on retail around their workplace. So what that means is potentially massive drops in spending in large cities. So we did a calculation just for Manhattan, and for Manhattan and New York, which is the central island in New York, workers plan to work from home 31% of days post-COVID. So we get that from the surveys because we've 15,000 individuals. We have several hundred in Manhattan that say they work there. We know for these individuals, pre-COVID average weekly expenditure near work was $283. We can gross it up. There are 2.3 million people commuting to Manhattan per work every day. So adding that up, you basically come to an estimate of about a 10% reduction in retail expenditure in Manhattan post-COVID simply due to working from home. And remember, that's obviously higher now because there are more people working from home now, plus there's also a lack of tourists. So not surprisingly, retail expenditure right now in Manhattan is down way more than 10%. This just says post-COVID, we see a steady state drop of 10% simply from working from home. It's also the case that rents are falling, particularly in high-rise buildings. So I have a separate survey with the Atlanta Fed where it shows that the demand for office space is about flat. So, people there's more working from home, so there's less people coming to the office, but each person wants more space. So net's about zero. But what we do learn is that there's a massive shift away from things like on the left, skyscrapers like, there's a picture of Salesforce Tower in San Francisco, towards things on the right. So kind of industrial park offices. And why is that? Well, those skyscrapers on the left have serious issues around A, getting to the front door. How can you take mass transit? How do you take the subway there? And B, how do you get up to floor 32? You got to take an elevator in which you're crushed in. So these are incredibly impractical buildings. They've been called cursed buildings. And so there's a big shift out to a lower level office space you can drive to and use the stairs. So third, productivity. I did an old paper with Liang, Roberts, and Ying in 2014 that came out in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. We ran a working from home randomized control trial in a Chinese multinational looking at 250 employees that were randomized by even on odd birthdays home. I don't want to go through the details, but one of the main headlines from that is these were people in telephone call centers making bookings, doing some basic computing stuff. They were 13% more productive working from home. So this was causal since it was a randomized control trial. And that is a very large increase. What do we find now? Well, in our survey right now, that's kind of not dissimilar to the types of numbers we're hearing now, I have to say. It's a little bit higher, but if you notice here, we ask people, how's your efficiency working from home during the COVID pandemic compared to your efficiency working on the business premises before the pandemic? Surprisingly, most people report it's either the same or a bit higher. And in fact, these numbers haven't changed that much over the 5 months we've been looking at. So individuals appear to think they're actually more efficient working from home. I'm personally slightly skeptical that would last if we ran working from home on forever. But as of now, it seems that people are relatively efficient. What that predicts is that in the long run, if we go to the types of plans I mentioned that many employers are talking about, so 2 days, say a week working from home, 3 in the office, and you apply that productivity estimate. So we do it individual by individual. We take what they said they're going to do post-COVID and how much that impacts their productivity. We estimate that would increase aggregate workforce productivity by 2.3%. So that's not massive, but it's quite substantial. In the US, that's like 2 years worth or 3 years of productivity growth. That's a pretty big uplift. And it's basically because if you have people work from home 1 to 2 days a week, it appears they're more productive. And we didn't previously do that. And it looks like post-COVID, we will do that. So that's, one nice upside. Finally, another upside to end on is time use. So roughly 60 million Americans have been working from home over the pandemic. We know they commute for about an hour a day on average. So Americans are saving about 60 million hours a day. I mean, that is an enormous amount of time. And of course, scale that up internationally. So we wonder what they're doing with this time. And we asked them. And the answers were, here they are. So 39%, almost 40% of the time came from working on their primary job. So, people are spending some of their commute time, not quite half of it, more like a third of it, working on their main job. And then if you look down below, 8.4% are working on a secondary job. Then there's childcare and home improvements are other big chunks. So I'd say that kind of other, in a sense, other home production type activities that are not your primary job or outside earning. And then the final two are indoor and outdoor leisure, which are about the remaining third quarter. So roughly speaking, 40% of that extra time saved from commuting, you're working your main job. Roughly 40%, a bit less, is kind of what's called home production, and maybe the remaining third or a bit less is leisure. So, it's great. In a sense, we're more productive using some of this extra time to work, but we're using most of it to do stuff for our own personal benefit. So to conclude, working from home has just changed in an unprecedented way, quite incredible. So it's gone from 5% pre-COVID to 60% during COVID of working days to we predict about 25% post-COVID. So it's going to drop a lot. Most of that drop is not that people are going to stop working from home, it's that they are going to remain working from home because they're going to reduce the intensity from 5 days a week down to something like 2 days a week. And we think the mechanisms behind this persistent shift are, diminished negative stigma, positive productivity experience, massive complementary investments enabling working from home, lingering concerns over density. A lot of people still are nervous about coming in the office, and finally network effects. And we think this has a series of broad implications. There are obviously many others, but most obviously, I think, on the negative, increase inequality. On the positives, it will make cities a bit cheaper, I think is good, given the affordability crisis. It will increase productivity, and I think it's going to free an awful lot of commute time. And with that, thank you very much again for the incredible honor, and I look forward to taking questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for this year's lecture. Fantastic stuff. Now it's time for the Q&A section of the evening. Professor Dr. Florian Engelmeyer, the Dean of Faculty of Economics at the LMU, will be moderating this section, which is a discussion between Nick and Raffaella and Clemens. And, of course, you. Now, I'm sure you all have questions that you would like to ask the panel this evening. You can post your questions in Zoom in the Q&A part. There's a button at the bottom somewhere. If you're using the German software, it's the F and A Knopf. So click on the button, post your questions there, and we'll be passing them on to Florian, and hopefully we'll have enough time to get through as many as we possibly can. So let's start the Q&A.
Thanks a lot, Nick, for that great presentation. It was as fantastic as I envisioned it to be. And I'm even more sorry that we were deprived of having you here. And the same obviously holds for Raffaella, whom I'd like to now bring immediately into the game by even more broadening the perspective and adding to the great input that Nick has given. So Nick in the presentation focused on, say, the incidence of working from home and, say, the more macro aspects. But it turns out Raffaella is not just a fantastic low data, but she also has a very recent and very nice paper that leverages super rich communications data that could help us to get at the effect of working from home does to the nature of work. And if you could spend like a tiny bit of time to expand on that, I think that would enrich the discussion that we can have in the next 30 minutes alone. Raffaella.
Thank you, Florian. Thank you. Yeah, look, I mean, Nick, I think, explained it very well. This is a very interesting phenomenon. It's happening under our eyes. I guess, one additional perspective on what's happening in working from home is that effectively it's changing the nature of how things are getting done inside companies, especially in organizations and in industries where team production is so important. So the perspective here is one where we're not just changing the location of work, but we also are changing how work gets coordinated. Now, this for organizational economists is a really juicy question. You would expect a lot of effort in trying to compensate for all the extemporaneous interactions that would happen in an office. And also you would expect companies and individuals to vary in their ability to adjust, which I think at the end of the day, the ability to adapt is going to determine whether we'll be able to be as productive as we were in the past. If not more, in some cases, there will be, I think, disastrous effects on productivity. So with that in mind, with co-authors, we decided to go and check what was happening using a very rich data set of metadata, actually, on emails and communications and meetings for about 3 million people in cities that were affected by the lockdowns. And as you would expect, you see these big jumps, these continuous jumps in how people communicate. We are having many more meetings. Maybe this is familiar to many of the audience, people in the audience here. They're shorter, they're having many more attendees, and the span of work has expanded considerably. I think the next question that this gives us proof that communication is changing. The next question, which will require a lot of work and additional work, is whether this adjustment is being managed well by organizations, by managers. What's the effect on individual employees? And there, I think behind the aggregate figures that Nick has shown, we really need to pay attention to heterogeneities, managers versus non-managers, skilled people versus non-skilled people. So in a nutshell, right now we have evidence of the world changing really massively. We still, I think, don't have a good sense of who's better able to adapt and reinvent their team productions as the world changes.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. So I think that's super interesting and sets the stage for a question that just came in freshly from the chat, which targets onto a very specific dimension of heterogeneity, in terms of the gender dimension. So from the communications patterns and the kind of the service responses, do we think that this may have a differential effect on men and women? Maybe Nick, you start out, and then we all can chip in.
Yeah, I wanted to start by saying, actually, before that, thanks so much to Raffaella for the fantastic laudation. We've been working together for 15 years. It's making me blush. I'm glad it's remote, but I was, you were super sweet. It was so kind of you. And also, I'm incredibly touched and, humbled by the prize from the CES. It's very sad I can't be out to Munich. I've come out many times to Munich. I look forward to coming again shortly. I'm actually, have a glass of water, but I would love to take Florian up on his offer with Clemens to go to come drink beer again in Munich. It's I know from the candidate, it's been a fantastic prize. So thank you very much. It's a very prestigious award. Looking back at who's won it before is quite incredible. So on to gender. Interestingly enough, to set the scene, if you look back at the 2008-2009 recession, it was called the man session, because if you look at unemployment rates, they tended to go up much more for men than women. So in 2008-2009, a lot of construction manufacturing jobs were lost, and so men did particularly badly. If you look at the COVID recession, it's very different, actually. You see that female unemployment rates have gone up far higher than males, because it turns out women are overrepresented in the types of industries and sectors that have been hit. So they tend to be more women in a number of service sector jobs that have contracted. In terms of working from home, interesting enough, we'd love to hear what Raffaella says. In our data, we don't actually see much of a gender divide. You may think we do, but it's there, before COVID data and during COVID data, there's not a huge difference. Men and women have both seen a massive increase. The big difference, by the way, that is there is over education and income. So basically, rich, educated people before COVID and now have massively higher levels of working from home. To tell you how much the difference is, if you compare in the US to people that have a high school degree or less, particularly those that have left high school at 16, so basically someone that's basically left school at 16, to someone that has a university degree, people with a university degree are more than 5 times as likely to be working from home. So really just a massive difference. So I'd love to hear what Raffaella says. We see it less on gender. We see it incredibly strongly on education and income.
I think, in fact, in the work that I'm doing as well on like time use analysis of large samples of workers, in the data, it's hard to detect a gender effect. It's much easier to detect these income effects, or even managers versus non-managers, for example, how their life has changed. That doesn't mean that there isn't an issue for women, especially women that perhaps don't have an opportunity to manage the many multitude of obligations that you have at home. So I think it's the reason why we're not detecting anything in the averages is because probably we go back to heterogeneities. There are for some women it's possible to combine these multiple responsibilities. Maybe depends on what you do, depends on who manages you, and others. Frankly, I think we might be seeing a horror picture here of having to go back several years in terms of your ability to combine a life and a work career. Yeah.
I mean, let me jump in onto that. I mean, one of the things that you just pointed out that there's this differential that we see in terms of earnings and the response to this possibility. One of the things that one, being an organizational economist, would expect is that those guys that earn more money are probably also working under different incentives. That brings you more broadly to the question of the nature of the job and the nature of the contracts in place. Two-part question. A, what do you think how important that is? And B, are we also going to see a shift in how job design and contracting works?
So I'm happy to answer this. I should say, by the way, in gender, Michelle Turtilt in Mannheim and Matthias Dopker have done some some very good work. Michelle used to be my colleague actually at Stanford here. So there is some very strong gender effects of the COVID recession. It just, we don't see it working from home in other dimensions. So on contract design, it's a fascinating question. So I'll tell you a story to get into this, which is there's someone in the US called Marissa Mayer. She was the CEO of Yahoo. And if you look at Marissa Mayer in the media, her biggest ever media spike was not when she took over, not when she left, but was when one Sunday there was a memo leaked from Yahoo that they were canceling working from home. And it was all over the media. And, Marissa was a former Stanford undergrad. I actually contacted Marissa and spoke to her about a month ago. I sent her an email saying, I'd love to talk because I know you went through this experience 7 years ago. And she wrote back and said, look, I've been bombarded by the media. I refuse to talk to them, but as a Stanford professor, well, maybe go ahead. So I got this, 45 minutes with Marissa, which is fascinating. And she said something that she said, look, if you think about how you manage employees, there's kind of two ways you can evaluate people. There's evaluate them based on inputs or evaluate them based on outputs. So starting with outputs, for example, for me, I want to be assessed on how I teach and how I do research. And I'd love, as they do, Stanford kind of lets me get on with my job and says, look, if you do great research and your teaching is good, we're happy. If you want to wear Hawaiian shorts and do it in the garden, that's fine. As long as you perform well, we're happy with you. Whereas managing by inputs is kind of old school. It's you have, you've got to be in the office Monday to Friday. You have to be there 9 to 5. I'm going to walk, the manager's going to walk around the office. Look at if you're actually typing on the keyboard, you look like you're productive. Now, maybe those different styles of management are okay, both in the office, but as soon as you go to working from home, managing by inputs is a disaster. You can't see what people are doing. And the firms I've been talking to that traditionally have managed by input have had to fall back in this horrible surveillance software. So there's this software that's truly awful. It's like measuring, you have to put it on your employee's computer. It measures every keystroke, takes random snapshots of your screen. Some of them are connected to your camera. So it takes photos of your face to check if your eyeballs are moving. Just quite awful things. So the bottom line of what Marissa Mayer said is when she took over at Yahoo, she needed to put in proper incentive management systems, HR systems. Once she had them in place, she could relax things again and go back to working from home. So it turns out that HR managers and kind of organizational management and incentives are critical to making working from home work. And there's never a period I can think in, recent history when HR has been as important as it is now. And I'm hearing this over and over again. And we can talk about other issues that are coming up, but simple performance management is critical now. Firms that did this great before the pandemic are surviving much better. Firms that had kind of very old-fashioned input-based management, whether you had to be at your desk and seem to be working, are really struggling right now.
That's entirely consistent with what I'm hearing also from entrepreneurs and managers at this end, that one possibility is that this is a crisis that is going to increase polarization of performance across differences. Imagine catching up in this situation is extremely hard. So the other story that I've heard is that perhaps now that nobody's in the office, you might rely more on this completely outsourced workforce. So you end up with two models: one where you trust your employees so much that they can work from anywhere, and the other one in which you trust people so little that they become just almost a commodity.
Raphael, I'm going to comment. Raphael's comment is fascinating. He says, another story I've heard that may be quite worrying, for Germany, also the UK, US, is many execs have said, we've discovered working from home works pretty well. We're having employees working from home 5 days a week, and they're pretty productive. So I've suddenly realized, well, why do they need to be in this city? In fact, why do they need to be in this country? And if you think alongside, the success of working from home, you have, populists that personally I'm not a fan of by any means, people like Trump and Brexit that are trying to stop workers coming into the UK and the US. And so a number of CEOs I've been talking to have said, well, look, if we can't get the workers to the jobs, let's move the jobs to the workers. So in Silicon Valley, for example, there's now a rush of companies that are thinking, why not we just hire people directly in India or Mexico? Why do we need to bring them over to the US? And so Germany will have, to a lesser extent, I think, a similar issue, but to the extent to which working from home, as Raf said, makes it obvious, you don't need to be in the office 5 days a week. In fact, if it turns out you can be pretty productive not being in the office ever, you can just easily offshore the job. So I think much as we saw there was a massive manufacturing trade effect from 2001 with China entered the World Trade Organization. 2020 is going to be the year of services offshoring, and suddenly a lot of service sectors are going to see massive movement of jobs overseas. And I think it's important for firms and governments to be aware of this and think about best how to, make use of the good sides, but be conscious of the negative impacts it can have too.
Perfect. So thanks. I mean, so one of the things that I should say, there's so many questions coming in that it's going to be impossible to cover all of them. But I think it's great news. And I mean, so Nick pre-announced that. So there's an incredible amount of interest in the study. One of the things that I've been urged to say is, I think 2 weeks from now, there's going to be an IFO study coming out, also looking at differential effects of working from home in German companies. So watch out for that. There's going to be interesting stuff on at least expectations on how there are differential gender effects playing out. Now, one of the things that came up repeatedly was, how much trust should we give in the productivity responses that we are getting in your surveys? There might, one could imagine various stories why, I would state that I'm pretty productive, while in fact, I'm not.
So I am happy to go first and hear what Raffaella thinks, but I did this study. I mean, oddly enough, I got into working from home about 10 years ago because I had a student called James Liang in my class in Stanford that turned out in a particularly weird way, a very kind of Stanford way, to be this founder of this massive Chinese company, decided to go back to university for a bit. So with him, I ran, as I mentioned, this randomized control trial. And there we saw working from home causally improve productivity by 13%. But I should note that these are people basically taking telephone calls and making bookings. So it's a very repetitive, non-creative task. And from talking to dozens and dozens of CEOs, in fact, including, interestingly, Eric Yuan, who's the CEO of Zoom that we're using now, an issue that's come up is kind of short run versus long run productivity. So in the short run, it seems like we can work from home and be productive doing the same task we've ever done before. The same, coming up with same processes and products. That seems fine. And this is the numbers we're seeing are very positive and firms are really happy. The issue seems to be around long run, being creative and innovative. And for the first, 1, 2, 3 months, maybe the pandemic, that probably wasn't an issue. But by now, I'm increasingly hearing managers saying, look, there's a big issue. If you go back to kind of comments like Steve Jobs would say, it's this kind of meeting over the water cooler or chatting over coffee or lunch. These new ideas are coming up. Well, that stuff's not really happening now. So I think if we don't go back to the office, at least for, let's say, 3 days a week, we're going to find in the long run a big drop in productivity and new creativity. So short run, I think it's okay. Long run, we need to have at least, let's say 2-3 days a week face-to-face time in order to come up with new ideas and push future growth.
Yeah. And onboard people, right? That's the other piece, that you can work from home perhaps easily if you know people you're talking to, or if there is something in common. But think about that graph that Nick was showing before, right? The differences across skill levels. So what worries me is that by losing that moment where we are all equal, we are suffering, but at least we are all in the office together, we might be losing the opportunity also to integrate new workers or different workers into the team. And that might be another way in which companies over the long run might lose productivity. So it's something to really pay attention to.
To also share a story, one of the things that I found noteworthy was that if you talk to the big corporates in May or so, they were reluctant to hire people, but less because they were worried about the long-term prospects, but because they were worried exactly about those onboarding issues that Raffaella just pointed out. So I think this is a first-order concern that we should study more. Now, let's move back to the macro questions, because I think there's a couple of very interesting features that relate to, say, the urban economics or the new economic geography of what that might result from those trends that you said. And there's many prospects that have been raised in the aspects that have been raised in the chat. One of them being, now we are seeing there's going to be less spending on office space in the inner cities, presumably. There's going to be less spending in retail in the inner cities. Are we going to look at a new crisis of the inner cities, so comparable to what the US has seen in the 80s?
So it's a great question. So I think there's two phenomena going on, and I'll tell you then how it affects cities. So on offices, I mentioned I have a survey with firms, around 1,000 firms in the US with Atlanta Fed and Chicago. We asked them what your demand for office space is going to be post-pandemic. And, there's a lot of change, but on average, the net impact was zero. So initially you're kind of like, that's a bit odd. Why would it be zero? Because we know there's going to be a big reduction in footfall into offices because more people are working from home. But it turns out almost exactly offsetting that is firms see a permanent increase in social distancing. So we're not going to remain the way we are now with masks and saying 6 feet apart, but we're not also going to go back to where we were pre-pandemic. I think everyone's kind of more aware of germs and, there's kind of a more sense of social distance. So firms told us office space demand is about flat, but they said they're moving away rapidly from high rises. So I think central business districts of big cities like downtown Manhattan or, tall buildings in London or San Francisco or Frankfurt, those have real troubles. I mean, they are buildings that are going to be less popular going forward. So we're going to move out to the suburbs. If you look at individuals, if you post-pandemic, we go to, let's say, working at home 2 days a week, it's not that people are going to suddenly move from, in the US, say San Francisco up to, rural Wyoming or Alaska, but they are going to move out a bit more to the suburbs. And so we're seeing already in US housing data, a very strong phenomena of rents and property prices in central cities go down and in the suburbs go up. In fact, my next door neighbor in Stanford, he owns an apartment in San Francisco, and he said the rents are now down by about a third. So it's, it is much cheaper to rent in San Francisco. Now, what does that mean for the future of cities? Well, Florian, as you mentioned, US cities have kind of been on an upswing since 1980. So if you go back to 1980, there were dangerous, scary places. In fact, I remember visiting New York with my parents, my first ever foreign holiday. We got a cheap flight to New York, went to McDonald's on Times Square. And I still remember as a kind of teenager seeing two guards with guns in their on their belts at the entrance to McDonald's in Times Square because it was such a dangerous place. And now that's unthinkable. So over the last 40 years, we've seen incredible progress of American cities. 2019, I think, is going to kind of be the high point. And we'll drop back. We're not going to go back to 1980. We may go back to, say, 2010, 2005. So I think that's a good thing. Cities will still be very expensive. They'll still be very dense. They'll just be a bit less expensive and dense than they were in 2019. And if you're living in a city, your rent will be down. You can either get a bigger apartment or maybe slightly lower income and a more diverse set of people can move in. So I personally think it's a good thing. If you remember, before the COVID, at least in Silicon Valley, in London and in New York, in Munich as well, there's all this affordability crisis concerns over people couldn't afford to live in cities. And that's been pushed back a bit because some of the wealthier people in society are moving out to suburbs.
So I can very much relate to that from a demand perspective. So that may be a good thing. But so maybe to bring in Clemens at that point. There's also the supply of those office spaces, and if we think back to 2007, 2008, the great financial crisis was triggered by deflation in the housing market. Is this something that we should be worried about coming after that crisis, like a burst of the commercial retail property market?
Well, I think it's a different story. I mean, it's more a relative price adjustment. So we see, prices in suburbs going up, and something else we don't see is these highly leveraged loans and the repackaging of all those loans. Everything that was going on. So, I mean, still there will be some adjustment, and some investors, renters will be pleased. Some investors may not be less pleased, and you could think about individual investors who have bought skyscrapers and things like that. It would be interesting to see how they're financed and whether there are observations that prices are going down of these very big projects, and if they were, that could have an impact on banks. I suppose bank supervisors should be looking into this now. And maybe be worried. But since I'm speaking, if I may, I have a very simple kind of basic question, which is maybe too broad. to both of you, which is, working from home and all of these changes, as maybe it's a typical European question. You would think, oh, well, come on, wait a minute, how about labor market regulations? What do unions say to this? Is there a role for governments to say, we don't want this flexibility, we don't want, or, you would also imagine that there is a debate about fairness. So is it fair that in the future, the highly skilled employees will be left to work at home? So is there a role for governments? And how far does this flexibility go? Can firms just, adjust that? They're working from home rules, but in particular, is there a case for government regulation and intervention?
Raffaele, you want to go? You're more European than me now. Sadly, England.
You're passing the hot potato. Thank you. Well, it's a really important question. I mean, I think at the very beginning, and having been privy to some of these conversations in Italy at the beginning of the pandemic, I think that the fear is that if we regulate now, as companies and workers are adjusting, it becomes really difficult to then go back. In a sense, we're still finding an optimum. I think it goes back to what Nick was saying before. Perhaps more than regulation, I would make sure that companies in the public and also in the private and in the public sector, that we have all the complementary inputs that are needed to make work from home appropriate. So in Italy, for example, there is a big discussion about working from home in the public sector. For some, it's been a huge source of inefficiency. If I were in a policymaker position now, I would really try to invest in all the additional managerial inputs that are needed to make sure that public sector workers can be effective and do and work from home at this point in time. I'd love to hear what Nick has to say about this, because it's a really interesting and I think non-trivial issue.
I totally agree. I don't have much else to add beyond it is clear that richer and better educated people are doing better out of working from home, and post-COVID it's going to be a valuable perk. I think that's going to be one factor that's going to lead to more progressive tax. So just to step back, if you think during the pandemic, we've had massive stimulus payments in Europe and the US. And at some point, we borrowed all this money, we need to pay it back. So taxes are eventually going to go up. And I think this is one of the list of factors that's going to mean taxes are going to end up going up disproportionately more on higher earners. So for example, in the US, when Biden's thinking about putting up tax rates, I think the fact that the higher earners are more educated, both had a better pandemic, we're more likely to keep our jobs and be able to keep working from home, but also had a better post-pandemic, will be one factor, meaning this group is more likely, I would have thought, to get taxed, to see more of the tax increases.
Fantastic. So I have a real problem here, because there's like roughly 15 questions that I'd really like to ask, but unfortunately, we're running out of time, and there's only one more that I can ask. But there's been an enormous interest, and that is great. And we probably have to think about whether we can do something about this as a follow-up. But that last question is one that I think is a very good one. It's a very simple one. And I wonder whether the answer that Nick and Raffaele are giving is going to be the same that they're going to give to a very similar question that they've gotten for the management practices. Namely, now there's all these advantages of working from home, and people like it and people wanted it, but yet we haven't seen it happen before. Why is that? Why did it take COVID for it to take off?
So I'm happy to go first, and that's Raffaele, and that's so I can do it. Okay. So this question has come up so much. In fact, it's a great question. A lot of CEOs have been asking it. Just to set the scene. We see working from home, something like 2 days a week, is both really good for employees. They evaluate it, as I've shown you, they evaluate it to something like equivalent of 10% of wages. It's also really good for firms because it increases productivity. So right now, full-time is not great, but post-COVID, this 2 days a week seems to be a win-win. So then the question is, why on earth didn't we do it before? And you may think, well, one explanation is technology. We couldn't. Well, that's not true. It turns out that if you think of all the technologies we need for working from home, email, cheap laptops, broadband, basically cloud for stuff like Dropbox or file sharing and video calling, all of them have been around for about 10 years. So I did a huge working from home experiment in China in 2010, and we quite easily shifted 250 people home within 2 weeks. So then the question is, why? And I honestly think it's a problem of groupthink or inertia. And everyone's kind of waking up to, at least, one of the few upsides of the pandemic is it's forced us to think more seriously about the way we work. And I think there's a permanent shift. To give you one other anecdote of something else that is yet to shift, this also strikes me as odd, is school holidays. So for anyone with kids, you wonder why on earth do schools and universities close for 2 to 3 months in the summer? It seems to make no sense. It's a long period of time and it's hard to deal with. And the answer is, this is the way it's been since schools were started, because kids used to need to harvest the fields. You'd have to release kids to go out and harvest the fields. But I don't know about anyone else listening, but my kids are definitely not doing any field harvesting, and I don't know anyone else's who are, but we still release them for 2-3 months over the summer. So this is another kind of anachronism of society that's gone back to 150 years. Working from home is the same. You're absolutely, it was a great question. I honestly think it was groupthink or inertia that meant that we hadn't done this earlier. And, we should flip it around and just say, of some of the small upsides of the pandemic is it's going to fundamentally change society in a way that I think for the large majority of us is very positive. Firms are more productive. Most people are happier working from home a couple of days a week.
So I guess probably my answer goes back to one specific aspect of group thinking, which relates to how, whether people trust your, employees to be doing work from home. So there is an issue of that. Another issue is that it's very hard to accommodate an organization where some people work from home and some work in the office. And I think that this dynamics of wanting, for example, management face time may be one of the contributors to that inertia that Nick was saying. You feel like you're missing out on some of these informal interactions that we all know, unfortunately, really matter for how you advance in organizations.
Thank you so much. As I said, there's at least a dozen more questions that could be asked. I think the topic is not discussed to the end. It's going to stay with us for a long time. And one of the nice features that probably is also giving me some hope, also in the light of the recent elections and the divide that we've seen, is that we've discussed that maybe there's at least some retardation of the agglomeration that we've seen in the last time, and that may also lead to some softening of this urban and rural divide that also, probably is responsible for some of the political polarization that we've seen. So thanks a lot for the questions to the audience, for the presentation and the answers. Fascinating stuff. Back to Marcus.
Thank you so much, Raffaella, Nick, Clemens, and Florian. Nick, I have a sneaky suspicion that your event next year, hopefully next summer in Munich, is going to be packed. So, and I'll be there too, if you like it or not. So that's it for this evening. Clemens, any last thoughts on the themes that we've been discussing tonight?
Thank you, Marcus. Now, thanks again, Nick and Raphael and Florian. I think this was absolutely fascinating. Particularly, I liked your field harvesting example and your point about the school holidays. In fact, we had a debate in Germany after the shutdown in the spring about dropping the school holidays or something. You might think, why not? But no politician dared to take it up because probably because you wonder why, but probably because the inertia is just so strong. And it seems, it takes a big pandemic to get us going. It's very interesting, maybe also an upside of all of this. Now, this was really fascinating. I think what I really love about it, and this is something which is Munich Lectures at its best, it's something very practical. What we've discussed today, it's about everybody's lives, and it's about a high level academic work and very complicated. You need economic theory and empirical work for that, and I really love that. Thank you very much. Now, I would like to thank the two of you, of course, Nick and Raffaella. Thanks for a fabulous evening. Florian, thanks for moderating this this Q&A so professionally. My thanks go to Munich Re, who've been supporting this lecture for many years. I would like to thank CES academic coordinator Christian Holzner and Martina Grass and the entire CES team. Let me thank in particular the team behind this year's virtual Munich lectures. So, no inertia here, we changed it all, and I really loved it. I also like the old format, but this one was really fun. So many thanks to Oliver Falk, Dear Weber, and the entire CES IFO team who made this possible. Thanks in particular to you, Marcus. This was a fabulous job you did. We couldn't have done this without you. Thank you very much. And finally, thanks to all of you at home for watching, participating, somehow working with us from home. Please do stay in touch with us, with the economics department at the University of Munich, with the CES IFO network, and with the IFO Institute. I hope to see you again soon at one of our conferences, be it with a physical presence or online. So thanks again, Nick. Great job, Raffaella. Thank you so much, Florian, Marcus. Have a nice evening, and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it just leaves me now to thank, of course, Raffaella, Nick, Florian, and Clemens. And I promise in the next live stream, Clemens, I'll pronounce your surname correctly. I don't know why I struggle with it, but there we go. Thank you, of course, for watching wherever you are in the world. And please stay safe, please stay healthy, and hopefully see you next year. Physically, in person, in Munich. Goodbye.